And whether you're going to swear an oath or an affirmation.
Well, my name is Andrew Moore. I used to teach at UWS for 30 years. I retired 10 years ago as an associate professor. And I'd like to swear on the Bible.
Please.
I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you. Would you like to make a short opening statement?
Well, as I said, my expertise in this area is simply as an historian. One might even say as a humble historian. I wrote my PhD broadly on the subject in 1984. That's a long time ago. I've written 3 books on the extreme right in Australia, partly or mainly, and many articles in books and things. And I was an academic, so I did what academics do. I just want to explain too that I write from a broadly social democratic anti-fascist point of view. I've had people assume that because I've written a lot on the right-wing movements of the 1930s, that means that I'm a supporter of right-wing movements. In the present day, I'm not. I'm presently even finishing a manuscript on, even 10 years after retiring, I'm still going on the wretched subject, on people who joined the right-wing movements of the 1930s. Who were they and what motivated them? The one thing I just want to make a general point at the outset is simply that it's a constant undercurrent, whatever, anti-Semitism, as it is racism, in Australian politics. It's, as Graham Davison, a very good historian, once said, it's the serpent in Australia's Eden. And there's been an alliing of anti-Semitism with extreme right fascism politics. And I think that mainly happened after World War II, with the example of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. But anti-Semitism doesn't just exist on the extreme right of politics. Indeed, if you go back to the 1890s and to the versions of the money power that were promoted by the Labor movement and the Labor Party, there was a strong anti-Semitic strand in there. And today we would associate anti-Semitism with extreme right, but I think it has had many manifestations on the left of politics, or broadly on the left. The most substantial and dangerous right-wing group of Australian history was a group in the 1930s known as the New Guard. They're best remembered for the act of theatre that Francis de Groot committed at the opening of Sydney Harbour Bridge. But beyond that, they weren't joking. They were very, very nasty. There were at least 3 attempts to stage a coup d'etat on Macquarie Street in 1932, and they didn't get round to it. They were a non-event that way. But here the point is that they, interestingly, I think, weren't especially anti-Semitic. They welcomed Jews to membership. Several of the prominent members, like Samuel Barber, who was a major furrier in Sydney, he was a Jew and a member of the New Guard. Indeed, interestingly, he told another member of the New Guard, a man by the name of Tom Walsh, who was a famous trade union leader but had crossed over to the right, that the New Guard must be accepted as fascist, and we must accept it as fascist, and it must be accepted as fascist. So my point is that perhaps here, the Premier of the time, Jack Lang, who the New Guard hated, was quite possibly even more anti-Semitic than the New Guard was. He had the view that the Niemeyer plan, the Bank of England sent over an expert, Sir Otto Niemeyer, to tell Australians to pull in the reins of finance, that is to reduce wages, and Lang promoted anti-Semitic ideology pretty strongly against Niemeyer. And broadly speaking, the New Guard was not anti-Semitic, and the left of politics were. But now, when we're looking at present-day events, when we look at the people who are roaming the streets, clearly they're happy apparently to call themselves neo-Nazi, they seem to be, and they are very strongly anti-Semitic. That's their modus operandi in many ways. And I suppose what that means is, unfortunately, anti-Semitism is very popular. Indeed, in a way, the New Guard, I think, would have been even more popular. It had 60,000, 70,000 members, but I think it would have been even more popular had it been more anti-Semitic. But anti-Semitism is certainly to the fore with right-wing movements at the moment, and it's good that this committee is considering these matters.
Thank you. Questions?
Thanks, Chair, and thanks so much for coming along, Doctor. It's really appreciated. The first question I have is, are you able to give us a sense within, I suppose, the boundaries of your expertise and what you've talked about as your work? Are you able to give us a sense of how the current presence of the far right compares to historical periods going back to the 1930s? Is it stronger now than it has been in the past? Is it bigger now than it has been? Is it currently in an ebb or in a high? Can you give us a sense of where we're at?
Well, I think the high watermark of the extreme right in Australia, excuse me, was the 1930s. There were groups like the League of Rights that existed in the post-World War II period that were strongly anti-Semitic. There were Nazi groups promoted after the 1960s. One, I vividly remember attending, I don't even remember the context of it, but there was a famous figure in right-wing politics called Ross May, aka the Skull, and he was at a meeting, I think it was about some intervention in the Middle East early in the 2000s, and I was shocked to hear him amongst this group of people. I was elsewhere, just walking past really. Every time he yelled out, "Kill Jews," the crowd would cheer, and that really shocked me. It's certainly not a perspective that I thought would be coming from that group of people, since they were broadly on the left and progressive people, I assumed. I think there's a constant undercurrent of these people, and in the 1990s, there's all these forgotten figures, like there was a wrecker from Warrackbanil, very hard to say, in Victoria, who was the leader of the right-wing groups of the 1990s, and he had huge support at the time, bigger than the groups now, massive marches. I saw one through Melbourne, and I was quite surprised. The present cadres of the right, maybe they're just passing phases. That's what I hope. But I guess it's good to be wary of them.
Yeah. So you wouldn't say that we're at, historically speaking, a high point in terms of the strength or activities of the far right?
I wouldn't, no. But one can be sanguine about these things. I mean, for much of the Australian history, the extreme right could hold its meeting in a telephone booth, but that's clearly not the case now. They've got significant support.
Yeah.
And figures who are populist leaders. One of the things that the New Guard didn't have in the 1930s was a good charismatic leader. I've never heard Thomas Sewell speak, the present guys, but I assume that he does have some charisma. That's not a good thing. But Colonel Campbell in the 1930s was among the most boring public speakers in political history. He used to send crowds to sleep sometimes, but that didn't help his cause.
There's talk at the moment, I've seen among elements of the far right, about entering electoral politics. Obviously that's something in some countries that they can't do, that the Constitution prohibits. Have you got any thoughts with your historical perspective on this question of the neo-Nazis or far right, which is not exactly interchangeable, I should say, but have you got any thoughts on this possibility of them entering electoral politics? Anything that we should know about, should think about?
Well, interestingly, the New Guard went into electoral politics, having failed in street politics. They started their own political party called the Centre Party. They contested 1934, 1935 elections. Most of the candidates, well, there weren't that many, 3 or 4, failed to do any good at all. They had, lost their money for entering the parliamentary race. That's not necessary. Again, by 1935, conditions had improved a lot. The Great Depression was the major motor of extremism, both on the left and the right. Not that the Communist Party did very well out of the Depression, it remained a very small force. In the eyes of the New Guard, which had, as I said, about 60,000 members at one stage, the New Guard was a terrible ogre and a fearsome threat. that took a fair amount of imagination to get to that view. They were very small. But still, it's hard to imagine that the New Guard and other groups and around Australia, there were similar groups in Melbourne and similar groups in South Australia, that they would have risen to any prominence at all without the Great Depression. Economic conditions deteriorate so badly. Unemployment reaches 33.33% in some working class districts. It was the motor of, and it had been too, if you look at the rise of fascism in Italy from 1919 to 1922, the economic conditions of Italy post-World War I were disastrous, and that drove a lot of Mussolini's forces. So, and the same happens in Germany. It's hard to imagine that Hitler would have risen to power had not the economic conditions and the disastrous state of the Weimar Republic intervened. In Australia, the Depression was it wasn't as bad as America or Germany, certainly, but it was still pretty bad. I mean, some streets, I remember reading, oral histories of the period, that some streets in a place like Bankstown would have, every second person would not have a job. So, it's not, it wasn't as bad as Europe, but it was pretty bad. And I think it was a major factor behind the rise of the New Guard. To the present day, I'm a bit surprised by all the things that are going on. I didn't expect it, or I don't follow it that closely. I sit and write calmly about the 1930s, but yeah, I am surprised that there's such support, or apparent signs of support. And all, as I said, the only thing that I can think as a solace is perhaps that these figures are transitory. They come and they go. There's one and there's another, and they all seem pretty significant at the time, but basically they don't get traction to great extent in the long term. That's certainly what happened to Eric Campbell in the 1930s. He was a major figure. He would have town hall meetings of 3,000 people. Pretty significant gatherings, but by the end of the 1930s he was a non-event.
In terms of anti-Semitism, obviously your area of expertise, the 1930s, predated the creation of Israel. We've got a lot of evidence that there's been an explosion in anti-Semitism since the events of October 7. Have you got any thoughts on how you would situate that rise in anti-Semitism, its cause, why it's occurred, the extent of it, the nature of it? How would you situate it in a historical perspective in terms of your expertise about anti-Semitism?
That's a good question. Mainly, I think I'd try to be sanguine about it, but I wouldn't be too sanguine. That, as I said, these anti-Semitism seems to ebb and flow. It never had a high point in a comparative sense to Europe, but it's always there. It's in the community, it's in the fabric of society, I think. The problem is a bit, and that's the final sort of words in the Right Road, the book that I wrote in the 1990s, was thinking about these sorts of things too, is that as soon as you censor these movements, that only helps them to gather strength. So until things get really bad, and obviously hopefully they won't, and hopefully we'll never see violence in the street of any great extent, then it's better to let the likes of Thomas Sewell rave on rather than intervene too much, because that only adds fuel to their fire and only assists them. And as I said, that does sound, as I'm saying it, a bit sanguine, but I look at Thomas Sewell in particular as a figure that is a short-lived one. He's not going to be around forever, but I wouldn't like to be terribly wrong about this, but that hopefully would be so.
Opposition? No, I haven't got any questions at the moment.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moore, for your attendance here today and for your evidence. Just interested in terms of what we're seeing now. We're, of course, seeing social media being used a lot, and once you scratch beneath the surface of some posts or some commentary, we're starting to see quite a lot of anti-Semitic commentary online. Just interested in terms of your analysis of that and how that might be fueling potentially some of this anti-Semitism that we're seeing from the far right.
I'm sure it is, and I'm not a huge consumer of social media, but even though I try very hard to keep unpleasant Facebook sites off my feed. I still seem to get a number of them. And obviously it's a different thing. Maybe I shouldn't be too sanguine. Maybe it's evidence suggests that people can build whole careers around being a Facebook warrior and presenting their views on Facebook. I'm always surprised by how many people get their political views, not just about the extreme right or whatever, but from Facebook. It's a much more instrumental source. The media in the 1930s was very small, very, well, there were the mainstream newspapers, and indeed, as opposed to the modern politics, there were papers that would represent the ideas of the Labor movement. There was a paper that the State Labor Party ran, and there was a party that the Federal Labor Party ran. They were both good newspapers, and they were also able to put the perspective of Labor, whereas most of the mainstream media doesn't have that sense of responsibility anymore.
And I guess this is one of the things in terms of some of these views. They're not views that are expressed necessarily if you're watching the evening news on TV. They're not views that are expressed if you're reading the daily newspaper, whatever it might be. But they're views that are coming out now online, and people are able to push these views online. Just interested in terms of, I guess, from your historical background, there obviously were communication pieces that were written at the time. Were they sort of direct mail or direct newsletters, or were they more widely available than that?
Well, an organisation like the New Guard and others that followed could be expected to have its own journal, and had several. And they were pretty intelligent journals, unlike most of the Facebook feeds. They were had some interesting articles in them about various aspects of political theory. But it is a big difference, Facebook, to the 1930s. The social media thing does make a big difference, I guess.
And I guess to that point as well, there's now the ability for people to do this, and I imagine it was possible in those days as well, but to do this somewhat anonymously as well, and to maybe even to amplify their impact by having either bots or by having anonymous accounts, which might be multiple accounts, and amplifying these views so that it seems even larger than what it might actually really be within society. Is that something that you're conscious of at all?
Oh, I'd agree with that, I'd say. I mean, it's hard to tell, but there is a significant presence on Facebook, obviously, of extreme right groups. As I said, I do my level-headed best to get none of them, since I use Facebook for family and recreational purposes. But you still get some, and I think that proliferates, and as you say, once it's on Facebook, someone else decides, oh, that's a good idea. And it's interesting how even within certain groups, like I'm a member of a motor racing club and Historic Sports and Racing Car Association, an entirely estimable journal, but I get their Facebook feed, and there's a couple of anti-Semites on there, so I just individually block them. But people find their way on to promote their views. Yeah.
And I guess this is one of the challenges in a sense. As you were saying, you try to keep away from it, but when you've got algorithms that then throw up what people want to see or what people are interested in, I can imagine even in your research sometimes that might then change your algorithm if you're having a look at certain issues, and then you might be consuming some of that content. So we do have this problem now that not only is it information that you may see in one shape or form, but you sort of go down the rabbit hole, so to speak, and once you consume part of that information, then you start to consume more and more, and it takes you to different places. Is that something you've analysed at all?
It's not something I've analysed, but it's certainly something I've noticed. It certainly happens that way. Going back to the 1940s, there was a very significant, very anti-Semitic, very extreme group called the Australian League of Rights, and they just had journals and they had meetings. But they managed to get a large following without social media. So had these organisations existed to the present day, I suspect they'd be, much more powerful. Social media definitely amplifies the issues.
And in terms of the current organisations, have you tracked at all their genesis with some of these organisations of the 30s and 40s, and how that, I guess, as you were saying before, sort of ebbs and flows in a sense, how they've survived or reorganised through those ebbs and flows?
I'm aware of some of the historical continuum. one of the historians and practitioners, an interesting guy, is Jim Salim, and I've been amazed that he hasn't appeared recently in terms of politics. He usually makes an appearance when there's an anti-immigration
was a
issue.
perennial candidate for Lindsay, I think.
Yes. But I just wonder where I've been. That's my main thought, is when is Jim Salim going to say something? I marked his PhD and it wasn't entirely a bad work either. People thought that, maybe you shouldn't give a PhD to a fascist, but the scholarly credentials of it were pretty significant, and it made a major contribution to knowledge, so that was what I voted for and when it became an issue. But he's a pretty bright sort of guy, and his ideas, he actually came from the left, proving the point about how eliding with the right. He was, I believe, some sort of Maoist at some stage, and then gravitated towards National Action and groups like that. But when you read his works, he's clearly of a different standard to most of the very ill-informed, very mindless, anti-Semitic or otherwise thoughts that are promoted now and have been in the past. The League of Rights, though, was spread all the way through the countryside, and that was its strength, I suppose. It was mainly had a stronger strength in rural society than it did to the present day. Well, I think it's now mainly moribund. I don't think it exists at all. But I'm aware that my knowledge is really about the 1930s. And I did write a book that took the right road that took right-wing politics up to the present day, but that present day was 1995. It has the distinction of being a book that didn't, on the extreme right, that didn't mention Pauline Hanson, simply because it was published in 1995 and Pauline Hanson didn't make her appearance till 1996. I've always rather regretted that, but it is what it is. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm interested in your views when anti-Semitism has become more widespread historically, whether that's occurred in isolation or in tandem with other forms of racism or hatred against other marginalised groups.
I would say the two of them, racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, are the same thing, and they do hold hands. They do run in concert with each other. The groups of the 1930s, even those that weren't anti-Semitic, were very racist. They were very Chinese, very old white Australia policy, which was still very much in people's mind. But, the cursed curs from overseas, your average orator would talk about, which were partly communist, but also usually partly the Asian devils of the Pan-Pacific Trade Union Secretariat. Anti-Asian sentiment was a strong thing in the 1930s, and clearly at recent stages in recent history, Perth in particular, anti-Asian sentiment's been, again, very popular, very widespread.
And when we're looking backwards, have there been any approaches by governments or any other civil society groups or others that have successfully de-radicalised people from the extreme right?
That's another good question. I think not. They just lose energy. They lose steam. They die out naturally. In the 1930s, that certainly happened. But, the New Guard in particular was just about to be prosecuted, or its leaders were, for seditious conspiracy, and that didn't happen. But the law was very heavy on, and the New South Wales Police, I should say, were really good in terms of suppressing the New Guard in the 1930s. There were major street battles between the New Guard and the police, and invariably the police won substantially. There's an event called the Liverpool Street Police Riot, and the famous policeman of that period, Inspector Bill Mackay, simply told his men to go out there and belt their heads off, and they did just that. That stopped a lot of I think that in particular stopped a lot of the popularity of the New Guard. Your average Artarmon stockbroker or lawyer from Killara wasn't that keen on having being beaten up by the cops. In fact, they probably never thought that they would be. So that took a lot of esteem of the New Guard. The police was a significant factor. Yeah.
There was a recent Victorian Legislative Council inquiry into extremism that was a very interesting read, and there was significant commentary around the need for responsible media reporting. For example, there's media codes of conduct around reporting of suicide or reporting around domestic violence to reduce the risk of exacerbating those issues. Are there examples or trends of media actually disseminating propaganda and supporting the growth of these movements?
The media always promote propaganda, so to an extent. Sorry, what was the precise question? I couldn't hear that well, clearly.
Yeah, that's all right. I'm trying to frame the question as backward-looking, noting your expertise is history rather than the present day. But I'm interested in the role of the media having disseminated propaganda and actually contributing to the growth or the strength of right-wing extremist movements.
In this country and in Britain, the media for a while was were very energetic supporters of right-wing fascist movements. I mean, the newspapers in Britain promoted Mosley until there was a big rally at Olympia in 1934, and they decided that the violence there was probably not entirely acceptable, so they backpedaled. But the media in Australia did much the same for the New Guard. The conservative media promoted the New Guard. They talked about it as a new force in politics, as a new spirit arising in the country, and aren't we all lucky? As I said, at the time, there was a Labor press. There's no Labor press now, not one that's like this anyway, not like the Labor Daily or the World. And they were also very energetic in putting counter-arguments against the things that the New Guard said and did.
Thanks, Chair. Those are my questions.
I've got a couple more, if that's okay.
Please.
Sorry, have you got your question, Greg?
Go
Sure. Yep. You were talking before about Jack Lang and anti-Semitism, and I suppose left anti-Semitism in that time period. Could you give us a sense of what were the central characteristics of left anti-Semitism in that time period?
Very nasty stereotyping of Jewish people, cartoons in the papers, in the conservative papers, angry declamatory language about the Jewish bankers who would cause the Depression, so it was alleged. Nasty cartoons of Jews and things, so it's an undercurrent that's always there, and it was in the 1930s, and those images have been used and reused.
So was it being used in that context to further particular sort of objectives politically or
Yes,
policy-wise? Yeah. What were the issues?
Well, Lang was a populist and a nationalist, and he was a very good speaker, and he promoted himself very well by these images, and these ugly images, but he did it very successfully. He was arguably the most popular politician of Australian history, but also the most hated and the most reviled. He had enormous support amongst the blue-collar working class in New South Wales in the early 1930s, and continued to have a fair bit into the 1930s. He didn't lace every speech with anti-Semitism, but he did a fair bit of it. That is, always talking about the cormorants of finance and the backed up by the Labor Daily newspapers. They supported his arguments, but I think anti-Semitism was pretty strongly in the. Well, I remember it being stronger in the community than to the present day. Anyway, when I'm growing up, you always used to hear at school. And I grew up in a conservative, middle-class area, state school there, and I have heard anti-Semitic things. It feels like all my life, but it's about the fervour that you're investigating. Is it getting worse? You're probably in a better position to judge than me. Hopefully it's not getting worse, but I wouldn't bet the house on it.
All right, well,
Thanks, Doctor.
Thank you.
For coming. Your evidence has been most helpful. We'll now have our next witnesses. full name, position, title, and swear either an oath or an affirmation.
I will. I'll take the oath. My name is Joseph Laposta. I apologise, I'm a little bit snotty. I've got a cold/flu, but this is important, so I'm glad you're suitably distanced, and I will do my best to get through the next half an hour. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at Multicultural New South Wales. I'd like to take the oath. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you. Would you like to make a small opening statement?
Yes, I would, but I'll keep it brief because I think transparency in government's important, and that's why we're here today, is to have as many questions and as honest conversation as we can. I'd like to thank the Portfolio Committee Number 5, Justice and Communities, the committee, for the opportunity to appear today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. As mentioned before, I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Multicultural New South Wales. Multicultural New South Wales has a number of legislative functions as are set out in our enabling legislation, the Multicultural Act of 2000. Firstly, I want to acknowledge the impacts of conflict, strife and violence, hate and anti-Semitism, and their impact on our communities around the state here in New South Wales. In a time where many people are still suffering from events overseas and local, it is everyone's responsibility that those around us get the support that they need. We've been through some unprecedented challenges before, but we've pulled through these because we are stronger together as Australians. And that's what we must continue to do. Come together as one, show compassion and understanding for one another, and recognise that we all share a common commitment to a unified Australia. There is no place for anti-Semitism in any form in our society. Racism and hate directed towards any group is abhorrent, and it is simply unacceptable. The New South Wales Government, the Premier, the Minister for Multiculturalism, the Chair of the Multicultural New South Wales Advisory Board, the Chair of the Faith Affairs Council, and myself have all taken strong, unequivocal stances against anti-Semitism. For more than 4 decades, my agency, Multicultural New South Wales, and its predecessors have worked to build and maintain a cohesive and harmonious multicultural society that enriches the lives of all people of New South Wales. Our work and the work of the New South Wales Government is guided by the multicultural principles, which are a policy of the state and entrenched in legislation under the Multicultural Act of 2000. This has enjoyed bipartisan support for more than 40 years. The objectives and functions of my agency are set out in the Act and include, but are not limited to, promoting a unified and strong commitment to Australia, promoting a cohesive and harmonious multicultural society. And whilst our core tenets remain steadfast, our work and approach evolve to meet the changing needs of our communities. Accordingly, my agency follows a whole of community and multifaceted approach to social cohesion. This approach recognises we can always do better, but we are all responsible for social cohesion, and we promote social cohesion from multiple angles. The last thing I'd just like to say is, since the terrorist attack on the people of Israel on the 7th of October 2023, and then the subsequent suffering for the people in Gaza, the last 18-20 months has been a really unenviable task for the staff at Multicultural New South Wales. It's been an incredibly difficult time trying to navigate that, and I want to commend my staff and the agency and all the more people more broadly that have tried to support us during that time. I hope my testimony today will be of use to the inquiry, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Questions?
Thanks, Chair, and thanks so much for coming along. It's really appreciated, and thanks to your staff. Just firstly, could you outline some of the direct support your agency has provided to the Jewish community recently to assist them to navigate the challenges they've faced over recent years?
Certainly, Mr. Lawrence, and thank you for your question. There's a couple of things first and foremost. The first thing I just wanted to talk around is how the agency coordinates the role of government in dealing with social cohesion and community relations. So under our legislative function, we have the ability to form a committee called Complan. That committee sits with education, New South Wales Police, all the key players in government, central agency and so forth, to work together on what are the issues that may be bubbling away in schools, bubbling away in communities, places of worship, et cetera, et cetera. That is a committee, unfortunately, in the past 2 years, but particularly even in the 2 years before during COVID, has been called an extraordinary number of times. The second thing that we do is we have projects, long-standing partnership projects in place that try to empower young people and stand up and united against divisive forces, standing united against hate and racism. 3 programs that are probably relevant to this committee: the Common Ground Project, an innovative anti-discrimination project from young leaders in schools, led by Jewish service organisation B'nai B'rith, Courage to Care; the Interfaith School Communities Project, led by Catholic Mission in partnership with Rabbi Zellman, Castle's Together for Humanity. In addition, the whole purpose of this is about empowering safe spaces and dialogue across different faith communities: Islamic, Catholic, Jewish. The NRL is a willing partner with us as well through Ernie Friedlander's project in Moving Forward Together, a social cohesion project, again working with young people to promote work in schools by tackling issues such as social disengagement, racism, gender inequality, bullying, promoting and enabling youth to be advocates for peace in their communities. In addition to that, as mentioned before, this government has invested a considerable amount of time and energy in empowering our faith leaders through the establishment of the Faith Affairs Council in 2023. This council meets regularly. I think they've met now 10 times. They've issued a series of statements. I think some of the statements that they've issued are actually world-leading, and I think we should commend Dr. Right Reverend Michael Stead and the entire Faith Affairs Council for their inclusive and I think very compassionate leadership during these difficult times. In addition, again, this government established the Premier's Panel on Hate and Extremism, which addresses the growing safety concerns of cultural and religious communities, the LGBTIQA+ community in New South Wales, and has discussed the impacts of conflict on young people, particularly in education settings. Recently, we're obviously very active with local councils as well. I partnered with Mayor Swan, Mayor Parker, Mayor Nimesh on a recent social cohesion forum. We continue to try and empower and support our community organisations right across the state. We've now distributed, I think, more than 19 grants in excess of $1 million to Jewish faith organisations, Greater Sydney, Newcastle, Byron Bay, to help them in improving safety and security around their places of worship and ancillary structures. We recently empowered the Rabbinical Council with a small but modest grant to help them contextualise faith learnings, knowing many of our rabbis are trained overseas, and then contextualising that to an Australian way of life as well. We've provided $8.5 million to the Sydney Jewish Museum. I think education is one of the core tenets and pillars that will help us in tackling anti-Semitism going further. The Emmanuel Synagogue, the Jewish Board of Deputies, Jewish House Limited, the Koa Club, many of these, really important and strong pillars within the Jewish community to help them in not just, I think, supporting the well-being and welfare and, ongoing health of their community, but more importantly, helping them in building the really important, I think we all acknowledge, soft bridges that need to come off the back of the last couple of really difficult years, particularly the last summer, and help just get back to normal, where we're all together as New South Welsh people and Australians sharing this great city and this great country and not being so hung up on divides about, faith or foreign conflict.
So just on that point, we've heard a lot of evidence about anti-Semitic incidences in the inquiry. Much of that is very clear-cut. We're talking about attacks on institutions, criminal assaults, threats and so forth. We have, however, had evidence, quite substantial evidence, about what I would consider another category of incidences, where I'm talking about things like street protests, strong commentary about Israel and other things where there's a strong body of opinion in the Jewish community that categorises those things as anti-Semitic, a very strong body of opinion in other communities, maybe especially Arab communities and Muslim communities, that says that that is not anti-Semitism, that is just political expression.
Yes.
Is the government funding anything that aims to build knowledge in both communities or both camps, dare I use that language, of some of the historical realities for each community,
Yeah.
as a way, I suppose, to build a common understanding so that our definition, our understanding of what is anti-Semitism can somehow align more. Is there space for each community to have a better understanding of how the other community interprets these very controversial historical facts?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. And I think my honest opinion is the past 20 months, there's been so much emotion and fear and anger being felt by communities because of largely issues that are occurring overseas, but also how they've then influenced the behaviour and sentiment of people here in Australia, and quite strongly. And I think part of the challenge over the last 2 years is we've almost gone into our own tribes, and we haven't necessarily been in positions to be able to have democratically different and robust conversations across some of the divides on these issues, and build an appreciation of alternate perspectives as a consequence of that. Every time we've tried to start to softly talking about the opportunities for roundtable discussions, leaders that have worked together in New South Wales to promote collaboration and dialogue for 20, 30 years, some of them, and have done an amazing job. It's just been so hot, Mr. Lawrence, where the instabilities overseas have, and the ongoing human suffering, whether that be, people that are still captured by Hamas now, that's just atrocious. And then equally seeing the suffering of young, particularly innocent kids, equally heartbreaking and devastating. So we've never really had, it's been such a transient, an unstable environment for the last 20 months that we haven't been able to necessarily bed down in the way that we would specific conversations about some of these themes, because just the emotion and often the anger that's there. That all being said, we have not taken a step back from tackling hate and extremism as a government and in partnership with our community. And I mentioned some of those community programs and partnerships before. Anti-Semitism is arguably the oldest form of hate. And so the tenets that remain with our Remove Hate from the Debate program, and I was listening to the doctor talk before about Mr. Farlow's questions around the manifestation of anti-Semitism online. I'm incredibly proud that our New South Wales government Remove Hate from the Debate program has engaged more than 2 million young people online with simple tips and tools to help them in tackling, taking the anger out of some of these online conversations, not allowing yourself to get caught up and swept, potentially identifying when you're potentially talking to a robot or a chatbot rather than a fellow human in some of the discussion that you're having. So, the Compact program, which is now engaged, in excess of 300,000 kids in New South Wales, and our Remove Hate from the Debate programs are two that continue to try and tackle hate and hate and racism as best as we can.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair.
Opposition? Question?
Thank you very much, Mr. Laposta, for your attendance here today and for all of the work that Multicultural New South Wales has done with all communities across New South Wales, not just the Jewish community, but all of them. I'm just interested in terms of those programs that you're running, how much has been dealt with in terms of dialogue amongst communities? Obviously, you've brought in new initiatives such as the Faith Affairs Council and the like, but across the broader community leadership, how much have you seen be able to change through dialogue?
So the first thing I would say is that dialogue with all communities has probably only increased over the past 20 months. And when I say that, proactively outreaching, checking in with, some really special people that have led the Jewish Board of Deputies over the past 2 years. And I can't even begin to think of the pressure that some of those individuals have been under within their community. The rabbinical councils, rabbis, and I mentioned a few before. I am, Emmanuel Synagogue there. Some of the leadership that has been in our New South Wales community that we've had direct daily, sometimes hourly, given the instability that happened over the past summer, been something I've been incredibly proud of. Equally, we can't just focus on one community. We're not going to solve anti-Semitism by just supporting the Jewish community through this. We also have to understand how it is being perceived by other communities, and obviously, naturally, our mind goes to those, in the Middle East and to our Muslim communities more broadly, but also a lot of other communities. What is their sentiment about the geopolitical conflict? Are they somewhat apathetic to it, and so this whole thing is just dominating the media landscape, and they want to get back to talking about, rugby league and cost of living and house prices, or is it all starting to manifest and sort of swirl around? I'm proud that some of those discussions between Jewish leadership and non-Jewish, whether it be Middle Eastern, Arabic, faith leaders, have led to discussions where support has been offered. I'm really proud of how strong our Hindu and Indian community was in supporting our Jewish community. I'm really proud where some of our faith leaders from different groups have gone over to stand shoulder to shoulder with our Jewish community for memorials, commemoration, harmony events and all of those things. But equally, the minute that, to Mr. Lawrence's question before, the minute that we sort of get a stable footing in terms of the geopolitical conflict in the Middle East, we as a society have to really invest in reconnecting and restoring a lot of those bridges. That all being said, again, it was fascinating listening to the doctor before. I think there's been a perception at times, it's almost this idealistic view of how everyone has gotten so closely and so well together for, generations or decades. Communities have their differences, so we also need to be realistic about what success can look like in New South Wales going forward, and not have idealistic views about how close some of these communities have potentially always been or always worked together. And I think, Mr. Fowler, it's really about finding common ground on potentially issues that aren't as related to this. It's our collective obligation to New South Wales and as Australians that we need to be focusing on and trying to, what can we control here in Australia to make us as strong and as united as possible? And potentially, it's not fair to say block out what's happening overseas, because obviously we can't, but equally not allow what's happening overseas to then import itself here and create even greater levels of breakdowns in social cohesion and trust in each other.
Thank you, Mr. Laposta. Now, one of the other areas, of course, we've heard about quite a lot during the inquiry has been in terms of security. Now, I know the government's had initiatives with respect to increasing security infrastructure for community organisations. Just interested, how much of that has been directed towards the Jewish community?
Yep. Just bear with me 1 second, because I've... Okay, so we've administered 2 rounds, and I think you're referring to the Safer Places for Faith Communities grant.
Yep.
This takes an all-hazards approach to safety, which includes social policy approaches and practical measures such as mental health, first aid training, as well as capital investment in physical security, fences, security cameras, etc. This program is not designed to increase or even validate concern within the community, but rather acknowledge that some places of worship could benefit from enhancements to security, and they could positively affect people's perception of safety. I think all of us agree, no one should ever feel threatened going to a place of worship. We are proudly a secular society here in Australia, but we practice 139 faith traditions. I would be incredibly disappointed in a country like Australia, relatively safe compared to the rest of the world, if people weren't. So since the program began, nearly $1 million, 908,448 to be exact, has been awarded to 19 programs supporting the Jewish faith across Greater Sydney, Newcastle and Byron Bay. In the first round of funding, 23 to 24, over $250,000 was awarded to 5 organisations affiliated with Judaism. In the second round of funding, over $0.6 million, was awarded to 14 organisations affiliated with Judaism. In addition, as I mentioned before, the Sydney Jewish Museum, the Central Synagogue and the Great Synagogue have also received additional funding from the New South Wales Government. And as I mentioned before, we've also provided additional modest support to some of the softer programs that are in place that are looking to build cohesive bridges through Emmanuel Synagogue, the Rabbinical Council, Jewish Board of Deputies and others to help in that sort of, as Mr. Lawrence said before, restoring and rebuilding some of the relationships and links that are there. And then the last thing obviously is in a partnership with White City, we've got a project to help support their commensurate security requirements as part of that redevelopment.
Thank you, Mr. Laposta. And also, in terms of course, we've learnt recently of Iran's role in some of the attacks on the Jewish community, and particularly at Lewis's Continental Kitchen and that. When did Multicultural New South Wales become aware of that, or the suspicions of that? Was that at the same time as it was made publicly known? Or?
Yeah, and can I just say, like, we're naive if we don't think foreign interference in this country, either through soft or in this really overt, disgusting, manipulative behaviour from foreign governments, we all must stand united and condemn any foreign government that is looking to undermine our social cohesion and our community safety here in New South Wales. So, was incredibly disappointed, and I found out through the media.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Laposta. And last question from me, just with the interest of time. In terms of some of those initiatives you were talking about, and particularly with the Sydney Jewish Museum, we've heard quite commonly, and we had a visit to the Sydney Jewish Museum, about the impact of Holocaust education in particular.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if Multicultural New South Wales has had any role in that, either with education or with broader community groups as well, in being able to facilitate Sydney Jewish Museum visits and the like.
And I sort of hoped you're going to ask this question. I've got great admiration for Greg Shand, the president of the Sydney Jewish Museum. Greg and I have probably spoken more than we would have liked to in the past 18 months about some of these things. I think he's a fascinating guy to sit down and have a coffee with. And he's got the ability to be able to, he's passionate about the Sydney Museum, but he's bloody passionate about Australia, and I really admire that in him. And he's a pragmatist. I've connected Greg Shand and Murat Dizda from the Department of Education to think about how we can really, once the Sydney Jewish Museum reopens, make sure that our understanding of the Holocaust and, you read Eddie Jacou's book, The Happiest Boy in the World, it's a slippery slope. It's a slippery slope, and we need to be really careful as a society, again, as the doctor was sort of talking before about the 1930s, as a society, that we never get anywhere close to that again. And I think if there's one positive thing that can come out of the last really distressing 20 months, it's that we take some really important learnings as a society about getting better to make sure that any extremists, any hate is stomped on as quickly as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My first question is a quick one. You responded to a question from the opposition about the grants that have been provided to Jewish community organisations. Are you able to table the full list of grant recipients under that program?
No problem.
From across all faith groups?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
My second question is a much broader one. You've talked about some of the work Multicultural New South Wales and the government has already done in terms of social cohesion. This committee's spent a significant amount of time with New South Wales Police. I suppose a social problem like antisemitism, like any other kind of racism, is not something that we can just police our way out of.
Yeah.
What do you see as the opportunities or potential solutions moving forward?
Whole of societal. I think the police are very good at enforcing the law, and whether that's been some of the task force and the strike force that have been implemented to try and reinforce public safety, particularly in and around the eastern suburbs, but more broadly around all of Mr. Lawrence touched on this before. Like for a large part, a lot of our protests have been incredibly peaceful protests, and majority of our protests that have been peaceful and have been in central locations that haven't been inflammatory or targeting community X or Y, or not connected to places of worship or synagogues or any of these things. There's an argument to say a lot of our peaceful protests have set an example for the rest of the world. Now, I'm really disappointed in terms of the narrative around protests, particularly more broadly, and how there's stronger stances about anti-immigration, or I don't need to tell this community in terms of what's going on, that are adding complexity in politics and all of these things. I mean, even in the last week, in terms of some of the politics that's being directed at community X or community Y, it's just completely unhelpful, if I'm honest, to creating a society and a country that needs to be united now more than ever. I think the police have done an incredible job, but Dr. Cohen, please don't think for 1 minute that I'm not in their ear as much as I can about a lot of the nuance that happens with these things. And I do want to take this opportunity to commend a lot of those hard-working police that have given up their Sundays from their families, or potentially come in from regional New South Wales to safely administer these protests as they have. But like I said to you before, we're not gonna get out of this by building higher fences and more barbed wire and more security cameras. We're going to get out of this not through a law enforcement focus, but more around restoring and re-establishing some of those links and investing in our social capital.
Thank you. And finally, obviously, the focus of this inquiry is anti-Semitism, and we've received a volume of evidence about the rise in anti-Semitism in recent months and years. But in your view, has that occurred in isolation, or has rise in racial hatred or hatred against other marginalised groups occurred in tandem?
I think it is. I think you can't ignore the direct attacks, particularly those perpetrated by foreign governments, that occurred on our Australians of Jewish faith in the past 12 months. Do I sit here resolved that all the different reports that we see in the media each and every day about percentages and numbers and everything is entirely accurate? I don't know, but I've got a dedicated team. I've got a systemic change team that is specifically looking at working with partners right across the board to understand the ramifications and impacts of racism and perceived ramifications around racism. I again take this opportunity to condemn all forms of hate and racism, and particularly that directed to the Jewish community around and through manifesting through anti-Semitism. So I don't think it's happened in a vacuum, but I certainly think that a small minority number of Australians have been disproportionately targeted because of their faith, and I can understand why that is incredibly triggering, thinking about generations of trauma that have, we're talking about parents and grandparents. I mean, some of the people in this room can relate to exactly what I'm talking about in terms of the genocide and the Holocaust. So I think we've all got to stand up united to that, because, as I said before, if we can never take our social cohesion for granted, and we can never allow these extremist and marginalised views to start to become mainstream, and we're all on a unity ticket with that, I think.
All right, any more questions? No more questions? All right, thank you very much, Mr. Laposta, for coming. I know you've taken one question on to provide some documents on notice. The Secretary will be in contact.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, committee. All the best.
Thank you.
We have our next witnesses, please. We're still on the air? We didn't go off. We're still on. Okay, thank you. Welcome. Ms. Matillo, can I start with you, please? Can I get your full name, title, job title, and have you swear either an oath or an affirmation?
Certainly, Chair. Sonia Minitillo.
Could you maybe talk into the mic a little more? That's it.
Sonia Minitillo, New South Wales Privacy Commissioner, and I'd like to take an oath.
Thank you.
I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you. And Ms. Wilson?
Thank you. Carla Wilson,
Could
Director...
I get you also perhaps to talk into the mic a bit?
Sorry.
You can pull it across.
Carla Wilson.
That's better.
Thank you. Director of Regulatory Advice and General Counsel at the Information and Privacy Commission, New South Wales. And I'll take the affirmation. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Ms. Matillo, do you want to make a short opening statement?
If I may, I would like to.
Yes.
Chair and committee members, thank you for the invitation to appear today to assist the committee with its inquiry into anti-Semitism in New South Wales. As a New South Wales Privacy Commissioner, I'm responsible for overseeing compliance with the privacy framework established under two pieces of legislation, the Privacy and Personal Information Protection Act and the Health Records and Information Privacy Act. This legislative regime applies to protect the privacy of individuals by regulating the handling of personal information by New South Wales public sector agencies, which includes state government agencies, universities, councils and state-owned corporations. Collectively, these two Acts establish the rights of individuals in relation to their personal and health information that's collected and held by the public sector agency, and it establishes the information protection principles and the health privacy principles that apply to public sector agencies and which they must comply with. The legislation governs how agencies handle personal information and health information throughout the life cycle and creates a framework for individuals to seek redress where their privacy may have been breached by a regulated entity. I'm aware that the terms of reference for this inquiry include reference to the practice of doxing, a practice involving a publication of an individual's personal information online without their permission and intended to cause harm. While the PIB Act protects the privacy of individuals by regulating the handling of personal information through those principles I referred to earlier, its application is contained to the conduct of agencies and not individuals or private sector organisations more generally. I note that recent reforms at the Commonwealth level have introduced a new criminal offence by amending the criminal code to address the targeted release of personal information in a malicious manner using a carriage service. Further, a statutory tort for serious invasions of privacy has also been introduced, providing individuals with the ability to sue another person where that person has invaded the individual's privacy by intruding upon their seclusion or misusing information relating to harm. The terms of reference of this inquiry also include the privacy arrangements around public information that may identify an individual or their address, such as land title records and electoral roll information. On this aspect, I would observe that the PIP Act includes specific provisions around the personal information held in public registers, unless those public registers have been specifically excluded by way of regulation or otherwise modified by a code of practice. These provisions include mechanism to address the suppression of personal information by public sector agencies in certain circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms Wilson, are you covering for both in terms of opening statement?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Questions?
Thanks, Chair. Thanks you both for coming along. It's really appreciated. I appreciate that your responsibility is in relation to public sector agencies, but just first, if a New South Wales government agency came into possession, and this could happen in a variety of contexts, but if they came into possession of the transcript of a chat group where things had been said by people in a chat group of, let's say, 600 people, what would privacy sort of policy considerations say about the innate private nature of that information, given that it was first generated in a very large group of people with hundreds of people having access to it?
So there's no straight, simple answer to that question. And given its hypothetical nature, I think it is difficult to sort of answer in a categoric sense.
Yeah.
I think if one was to leave to one side how that information came to exist and its possession, in terms of the privacy regime, the principles apply to the collection of information by agencies, and so the issue would become, has the agency collected that information? And if it has collected it, would that then give rise to the application of the privacy laws of New South Wales? I'm reluctant to give a definitive answer because these things are inherently complex and there are many different components that might feed into how that information has come into the possession of an agency. But in the truest sense, under New South Wales privacy laws, if an agency is collecting information, and generally that information is collected from the individual to whom the information relates, that's how the legislation is generally operating. Or intended to operate, it is at that point that the legislation would have application to that collection.
So there's not necessarily a requirement that the information be private in its nature?
Without appearing to sound as if I'm trying to be unhelpful, again, it's very contextual and it's very hypothetical. The legislation in New South Wales applies to essentially the collection of personal information from the individual and sets requirements about the collection of that information from the individual. And I'd be reluctant to offer a generalised view about whether it's private or not private in a hypothetical context.
Sure, thank you. In terms of New South Wales law, and I'm sure you're aware that our terms of reference require us to look at things like land title records, electoral roll information, and other things that identify an individual or their address. Could you just talk us quickly through what does New South Wales law provide in terms of a person's capacity to apply to have their particular information made secret? Like, what are the statutory preconditions, etc.?
Certainly. So I think there are, if I can split that question into two parts and deal with the land titles separately to the electoral roll. So the first observation I would make is in terms of these registers, generally these registers are not created as a consequence of the creation of the Privacy Act. They generally are formed out of their own statute or a different set of statute provisions. And they become known as a public register for the purposes of the Privacy Act. However, under the Privacy Act, there are certain of those registers that are exempt by way of regulation, and the land titles is one of those, to which the public register provisions that I mentioned in my opening statement that exist under the under mine legislation exempt the operation of the land titles. But more broadly, in terms of the land titles, as I understand, and this is a matter that the Office of Value General is probably more expert to answer, but broadly speaking, the information is contained in that register. Access to that register is a person can make a request to have the information suppressed under that legislation, and if that the agency then makes a decision as to whether or not the interest in retaining or not retaining the information in the register and whether it should be suppressed. And as I understand, there are provisions in the land titles statutes that would enable review of that decision to occur. But the public register provisions as they apply under the PIP Act in terms of that requirement exempt by way of regulation the Land Titles Act. In terms of the electoral roll, similarly it's considered to be a public register in that and therefore the Part 6 register provisions under the PIP Act do apply. And as I understand, the way that is given effect by the Electoral Commission is you can make an application to access the electoral roll. There's a particular process and a particular form that the Electoral Commission has that you must follow, and the intention is that you are not to access it for a purpose other than for which the electoral roll was established, which may be in order to establish your the correctness or the accuracy of your entry on the electoral roll, for example. You can make an application for suppression. Sometimes there are separate provisions that apply for silent electors that exist under the electoral roll separately. And so those provisions enable an agency to consider whether or not there is potentially a safety or a health wellbeing consideration and balance the public interest. If the agency is of a view that the public interest outweighs, then it does not have to suppress the information.
That's helpful, thank you. In terms of the subject matter of this inquiry, anti-Semitism, are you aware in the last couple of years, let's say since the events of October 7 and the increase in all sorts of things since, are you aware of any particular problem where people are being doxed through the use of government-held information? Are you aware of an increase in applications for information to be kept confidential? Have you had more issues being drawn to your attention about those sorts of things?
So not directly. We receive often inquiries around a range of matters. So I'm aware that, or I'm advised that our records indicate we've had 2 direct inquiries around doxing, but they relate to private sector individuals, so not within my legislative remit. And I'm not aware of any specific or direct nexus between a complaint or an issue arising that connects those 2 issues as a consequence of doxing specifically.
Okay. In terms of, and excuse me if I'm putting you on the spot in terms of the esoterics of constitutional law, but does New South Wales have the power to create criminal offences about privacy and things that breach privacy? Is the federal jurisdiction only there because of telecommunications? Is there capacity for New South Wales to create more general laws about rights to privacy and criminalisation of acts that infringe upon it?
That's a complex question, and you're correct. You're asking me to offer a view about the operation of constitutional law, and I'm no constitutional lawyer. I guess my remit is concerned with the application of privacy law to the conduct of public sector agencies. And therefore, currently in the New South Wales privacy laws, there existing offence provisions. But if you were asking a question that is more general in its application, I think that's perhaps a question I'm not best positioned to answer.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Just a follow-up question, Commissioner. The two complaints in relation to doxing that you referred to, what period were they covering?
So I understand, based on the information from my office, that was a look at records that went over since 2020, the last 5 years. I'm happy to...
So back to 2020?
Yeah, so my understanding is one was in 2020, that inquiry, and the other was in 2023.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Collins.
Thank you. I'm asking more potentially challenging questions that might need to be taken on notice. I'm interested in offences both at a Commonwealth and a state level relating to doxing, particularly where there's reference to carriage service, and in your view, how effective that is when it relates to social media specifically, and the ability to enforce those provisions.
A difficult question because it pertains to the conduct of social media, which entities are not within my remit in terms of their conduct. And in terms of the effectiveness or otherwise, I think that's a matter of potentially perspective. There are many perspectives around that. I'm happy to take that on notice and perhaps provide a further response. But it lends itself to a view of the operation of federal legislation and the offences, and certainly, for example, the serious tort has only just commenced in June, so it may be difficult to offer a view.
Sure. I suppose in taking that on notice, I'm happy to provide additional context for my question.
Certainly.
I suppose a number of the examples that the committee is being provided with in terms of doxing relate specifically to social media, where that is the carriage service that's used, and noting particularly a lot of these are corporations operating out of other jurisdictions. I'm interested in your views as to the effectiveness of our current framework to rein that in.
Certainly, I'm happy to take that on notice.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
All right. Any more questions? No more questions. Okay, we're all questioned out. Thank you very much for coming. I note there was a question taken on notice. Secretariat will be in contact with you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.